watching on YouTube or Facebook. We're so glad that you're here and so glad that you've chosen to spend your Sunday with us.
Yeah, on this episode of Beyond at Home, we're going to talk about something you might actually already know, and that is that it's actually quite easy to become a Christian. It doesn't cost you anything. However, Jesus never asked us to become Christian. He actually asked us to follow him.
Yeah, but before we get to that though, we just want to welcome you, especially if you are new here. We're so glad that you've chosen to come and hang out with us. At Beyond, we want to create a church that unchurched people love to engage with. So we would love to hear from you in the comments and engage with you further.
Yeah, and if you want to keep engaged with us or in touch with what we're doing, please like or subscribe or follow our Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. And that way when we post, you'll get notified. And when we go live at Beyond at Home, you'll get to know too.
Awesome, we'll see you after the message.
See ya.
In today's episode of Beyond at Home, I want to talk specifically to church people. And if you wouldn't consider yourself a church person, or maybe you used to be a church person, but you walked away, I think you're going to find this message super helpful, because we're going to address the reason why you wouldn't consider yourself a church person or why you walked away from church to begin with. So let's jump in. Now, if you grew up in church, maybe you grew up in a church similar to this one, where you sat in rows and you listened to someone tell you that, hey, salvation is free, it will cost you nothing. Jesus died on the cross for your sins. And that's a pretty incredible message when you think about it. Now, here's where this thing becomes a little bit challenging, because when you open up the 4 biographies that we have on the life of Jesus, when you read the letters that a guy called Paul wrote to a whole bunch of churches around the Mediterranean Rim, you never read anything about anybody becoming a Christian, right? Because what you discover is that the term Christian was only used a handful of times in the collection of documents that we would call the Bible. And it was often used in a derogatory term. It was slang language that people outside the Jesus movement would use to refer to those people inside the Jesus movement. In fact, in the first century, the term Christian literally is a label that means one associated with Christ. It appears only 3 times in the entirety of the New Testament, and the first time it shows up is in a document that a historian called Luke wrote. And it happened that Luke is recording this event that happened in the metropolitan city of Antioch. And in telling us how this label originated, Luke defines for us what this label meant back then, but not so much what it means today. In fact, in Acts chapter 11, verse 26, it says, and that the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. Which leads us to kind of ask the question, well, who is the disciples? Because maybe if you grew up in church, you kind of heard a little bit about church, maybe at high school or in chapel, you kind of think to yourself the 12 disciples, Jesus' merry bunch of misfits. But this is bigger than that. This is after Jesus' resurrection, and disciple really meant anyone who followed the teachings of Jesus, anyone who applied the teachings of Jesus to their life. And one of the reasons that we're led to believe that the label Christian in the first century was a derogatory term was because that Christians were believed to be part of a sect or part of a cult. People would actually refer to them as the Nazarene sect or the Nazarene cult because Jesus was from a town called Nazareth. But there was something unique, something strange about this group of Jesus followers that the people from Antioch saw was different to the other idol worshippers of the area that they lived in. And they couldn't just simply call them disciples, because in that day, everyone had a disciple. Rabbis had disciples, philosophers had disciples, teachers had disciples, everyone had disciples. And so they didn't want to call them disciples. So instead of calling followers of Jesus disciples, they coined the term Christian. And this is challenging for me, but I also hope it's challenging for you, because we may be okay to claim the title and the badge of Christian the way in which we use it in the 21st century. But for the next few minutes in this video, what I want us to do is wrestle to the ground an uncomfortable question. It's easy to say you're a Christian, but are you a Jesus follower? To answer that question, let's change the location. And this is a terrifying question for us to ask, for those of us who want to wear the label Christian, because it forces us to ask, are we really following, or are we simply believing? Because you and I can define and redefine the term Christian as much as we want until it fits our faith or our approach to faith. But neither Jesus nor anyone in the Bible defines what they mean by the term Christian. But Jesus follower? Well, that doesn't really need any kind of definition, does it? If you've been a part of our community for any length of time, you've probably heard me or maybe one of the other communicators say something along the lines of this. Becoming a Christian is easy. It will cost you nothing. But following Jesus, it will eventually cost you something. And for the men and women who have made the biggest difference in the world, it has always cost them something. And so when Jesus stepped into history to bring the kingdom of God near. And this kingdom of God is really just a different way of living. It's living in a different direction. And in Jesus' most famous but least applied message or sermon of all time, called the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus begins to describe in detail what this different way of living looks like. And this sermon, it didn't happen inside the walls of a church building. In fact, it happened on the side of a mountain, and there was a crowd who were following Jesus because Jesus always had crowds following him. And this sermon, Jesus flipped their value system upside down. He began to say things like, hey, love your enemies. It's easy to love the people who you like, but love the people who don't like you. He began to say things like, if someone asks for a little, give them a lot. He began to say things that, hey, don't ask to get right with God until you've got right with the people in your family or your friendships or your work or your school. He even said things like, stop looking out for the speck of sawdust in someone else's eye until you've pulled the log out of your own eye. That way you can love other people better. It was epic. It literally flipped an entire value system on its head. Then Jesus drops the mic and he heads to Capernaum. And the crowds, they just followed him to Capernaum. And the reason they followed him is because he taught like one who had authority, and they were amazed. And so this street party is literally happening on the way to Capernaum in the middle of the day. But then the mood suddenly changes. And the reason why the mood suddenly changes is completely lost on you and me in the 21st century. But I guarantee you, for the people who were there, for the people who were writing the biographies on Jesus' life, this moment was not lost. And the reason the mood changes is because a Roman centurion walks up to Jesus and asks for a favor. Now just remember, Jesus had just given this entire message on love your enemy, do good for those who don't love you or don't have your best interests at mind. And just so we've got a little bit of context of what's going on here, about 100 years prior, the Roman general Pompey had stormed into the Temple of Jerusalem and completely desecrated it. He had then left Jerusalem and taken with him thousands of Jewish slaves. And in that moment, the region that Jesus was in, Judea and Galilee, no longer were independent. In fact, they became part of the Roman Empire. Then in 40 BC, Herod the Great is crowned king of the Jews. And what was so disrespectful to the Jewish people is that Herod wasn't even Jewish. He was a Roman, and he was constantly doing things to offend Jewish people. He was constantly doing things to desecrate the temple. He was constantly stealing money out of their treasury funds. Then Jesus appears on the scene somewhere in the 20s. And Rome had commissioned the governor Pontius Pilate to oversee this area of Judea and Galilee. And Pilate is known as the person who introduced crucifixion to that region. Constantly offended the Jews on purpose. In fact, he offended the Jews so much that Rome actually called him back to answer for his crimes. And Pontius Pilate ended up eventually committing suicide because he didn't want to face the consequences of his actions towards the Jewish people. My point here is that there was just so much history between the Jewish people and between Rome. This wasn't a simple favor being asked. This was a Roman soldier asking a Jewish man for help. And not only that, but it was a Roman centurion, and centurions earned their ranks through violence. They were known as being violent people. They were known for whipping their own men, and in some cases actually killing their own soldiers to assert their dominance. But it gets even worse, because we know from history that there would have been no actual Roman centurions in that area until 10 or 15 years after the conversation that Jesus is having right now. So what that means is that this is a Roman from around the region of Galilee. And the people who were lived around the region of Galilee who were Romans, they viewed the Jewish people as subhuman. See, this centurion represents everything that Jesus had a right to hate. Personally, nationally, and emotionally as well. And now he stands in front of him and asks for a favor. Have you ever been where Jesus has been in this moment? Maybe someone asks you for a job recommendation. You think to yourself, after the way you behaved, how could I possibly recommend you? Maybe someone asks you to borrow money and you think to yourself, you haven't paid me back for the last 3 times that I lent money to you. Maybe someone else says, hey, can you give me a second chance? And you're thinking to yourself, well, it's kind of more like your 5th chance, really. And isn't it just true I know it's true for me, and maybe it's true for you, that we would much rather do a random act of kindness for someone who's never done anything for us and we don't know anything about? Isn't it so much harder to do an act of kindness for someone who's hurt you and for someone whose story that we know? Because doing something for someone who's hurt you or hurt someone that you cared about, at times, that can just seem like too much. But the reality is, becoming a Christian, that's easy. But following Jesus, well, that calls us to become uncomfortable at times. And if you do good for people who are like you, well, that brand of love isn't unique. In fact, that brand of love keeps us hidden away behind our labels and in our tribes and in our safe places. So Jesus and the centurion are standing there, eye to eye, and you could hear a pin drop. The heat is hanging in the air, and everyone wants to know the answer to the question. What is Jesus going to do next? Everyone had heard what he had said on the side of the mountain, but now everyone is looking at his life. And this is an incredibly dangerous moment for Jesus. Because if Jesus was to continue to live out what he spoke on the side of the mountain, he could lose the crowd, because he could be seen to be sympathizing with the Roman Empire. But Jesus stayed true to his teachings, and Jesus continued to introduce a brand new way of living into the world. And he said to the Roman centurion, he said, not only can I help you, but I'll actually come to your house to help you. And then the Roman centurion says, no, there's no need for you to do that, because I know that you can do what it is that I need you to do from right where you're at. And I can imagine that maybe the crowd kind of breathes a sigh of relief, thinking, thankfully, we don't have to go to the Roman centurion's house. And then I can just imagine, after this has all taken place, that Jesus gives a smile to the crowd, turns and taps Peter on the shoulder. Let's go grab some lunch. Now, let's bring it back to us. Because if that interaction is what it's required of us to be Jesus followers, it's no wonder that we reduce faith to a label. It's no wonder that we're happy to settle for Christian, right? Because we can go to a building, or we can watch an online video like this. We can take notes and post it to our Instagram, or highlight our Bibles, or feel like the band was really on point and say things like God was moving, but never actually follow Jesus. Because come on, it's so much easier to be a Christian than it is to be a Jesus follower. And if you choose to settle for Christian, if I choose to settle for Christian, all we will do is contribute to the challenges that are facing our nation and the world, and just us as human beings in general. Because you'll believe that every single person is created uniquely. You'll believe that every single person has inherent value because God has breathed life into them. But that's where it'll end. Correct belief. And correct belief is an action. See, we need to follow Jesus because we need to act, We need to speak out against injustice. We need to speak out when things aren't right with the world. But if you settle for Christian, you'll settle for just believing right. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to make a decision. And the decision I want you to make is actually the 4 Monday for this episode. The 4 Monday is just simply the easiest way to engage with everything we've been talking about in this video. And the 4 Monday is simply don't be content to be a Christian. Choose to follow Jesus. I want you to decide that you're not going to be content to wear a label. I want you to decide that you're going to follow Jesus even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's hard, even when it might cost you something. Now, if that's confronting to you, if that's challenging and you kind of resist that, trust me, I get it. But the good news is Jesus saw people like me and you coming. Jesus saw people who would be content to simply wear the label of Christian coming, and he addressed it. Jesus anticipated a generation that would be content to simply know, but not do. And what I find so interesting is that Jesus reserved his harshest words for people like that. In fact, as Jesus is wrapping up his Sermon on the Mount, remember that most epic sermon ever, as everyone's leaning in, he tells them a story. And this is what Jesus says to people who are content to simply know but not apply. He says, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Jesus literally says that if you're content to settle for Christian, you're a fool. And the reason that you're a fool is because you've convinced everyone of something you're not. You've convinced everyone that you're a Jesus follower when you're really not. You've convinced everyone that you found favor with God when you really haven't. Jesus even points out that, hey, the house looks really nice from the outside. But when the storm comes, the reason it collapses is not because of how the house looks. It collapses because of the foundation that it was built on to begin with. You see, the men and women who made the biggest difference in the world are not the men and women who simply believed right. They're the men and women who acted when something wasn't right and when they saw an injustice in the world, even when it cost them something. So my invitation to you and my invitation to me as well is, let's not just be content with Christian. Let's follow. Let's do good for those who can't or won't do good for themselves. Let's love those who won't or refuse to love us. When the centurions in our world rock up and they're standing in front of you and in front of me, let's do what's challenging. When we're tempted to resist, let's lean in. And that brand of love is the love that Jesus invites us to. You see, God wasn't simply content to believe right. God acted. And Jesus acted by giving his life on the cross. And it's through that act, and it's through the pages of the New Testament that Jesus turns around, looks over his shoulder through history and whispers to us, follow me. That brand of love can make an incredible difference in the world, but that brand of love requires us not to simply be content to wear a label. It requires you and it requires me to follow. And if you're curious about how you can move from just wearing the label Christian to becoming a Jesus follower, then you are not going to want to miss next week.
Yeah. Let's go again.
Yeah. Okay. Hey guys, we hope you enjoyed the message. If there was actually a name of somebody who came to mind while you were watching that you thought you'd really like to share that message with them, we would really encourage you to do that, whether that's on YouTube or Facebook.
Yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate that you've watched either live with us or on demand at home anytime. But one thing at Beyond, we really recognize that everyone's on a journey and we really want to provide you that next step in your faith journey.
Yeah, so after the message, the next step that we would love to recommend is actually our Beyond the Message podcast, which comes out every Wednesday. So jump over to whatever platform you normally watch your podcast from and you can continue that conversation with Chris.
Yeah, apart from that, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you have a great week and we'll see you here next week.
See you guys.
See ya.